There is a specific moment that most people who have been through something difficult will recognize. The worst of it is behind you. Not entirely, not cleanly, not with the tidy resolution that makes for a satisfying story, but behind you enough that you can feel the ground returning under your feet, can sense the first tentative signs of something that might, if you protect it carefully, eventually become solid again. And in that moment, many people do the same thing. They reach for their phone. They open the app. They begin to compose the update that will let everyone know where they are in the process. The vulnerability post, the honest reflection, the brave announcement of a journey they are still very much in the middle of. Within hours, the responses arrive. The hearts, the fire emojis, the comments full of you are so strong, and this is so inspiring, and thank you for sharing this. And something that felt, before the post, like a quiet, fragile new beginning, something that was just barely finding its own weight, suddenly feels different. Lighter, perhaps, in one sense, but also somehow less, as though something that was yours has been distributed. Something that was private has become a performance. Something that was growing in the dark has been brought into a light it was not yet ready for. Carl Jung would have recognized this experience immediately, not because he lived in the age of social media, but because the underlying dynamic it describes is one he encountered throughout his clinical career and addressed with characteristic directness in his writings on the individuation process. Jung believed that certain kinds of psychological transformation depend, at a structural level, on privacy, on the specific conditions of internal quiet and protected inwardness that public sharing, however well-intentioned and however warmly received, systematically destroys. He did not make this observation as a social critique or a commentary on the virtue of discretion. He made it as a clinical and psychological observation about how genuine inner change actually works and what conditions it requires to complete itself. This video is going to take that observation seriously and follow it wherever it leads. We will examine the specific psychological mechanisms by which premature disclosure of a recovery or a real transformation undermines the very process it announces. We will trace Jung's thinking on privacy, silence, and the sacred through his work on the individuation process, his engagement with alchemical symbolism, and his understanding of what he called the numinous, the specific quality of experience that genuine inner transformation carries and that requires protection from the ordinary noise of collective attention. We will bring in the work of Winnicott on the capacity to be alone as a developmental achievement, and the research on social sharing and motivation that has confirmed, from an entirely different scientific direction, what Jung observed clinically. We will look at the specific ways that modern social media culture has created structural incentives for the premature public, performance of transformation that are directly opposed to the conditions actual transformation requires. We will examine the mythology of the wounded healer and the hermit's withdrawal, and what the oldest human wisdom traditions have consistently understood about the relationship between silence and genuine change. And we will walk through concrete, practical guidance for protecting your own recovery and your own genuine inner work from the specific drain that premature public announcement produces. By the end, the impulse to share where you are in your process will not have disappeared, but you will understand it differently, and you will have a clearer sense of when sharing serves your actual growth and when it substitutes for it. Before we go further, it is worth naming something directly. The observation we are going to develop in this video will, for many people, land as a criticism of vulnerability, of honest sharing, of the kind of courageous openness that has been, in recent years, correctly identified as an antidote to the shame and isolation that surround difficult experiences. This is not that criticism. Genuine vulnerability, offered in genuinely safe relational contexts to people with the capacity to receive it, is one of the most important and most healing things available to a human being in difficulty. What Jung is pointing toward is something more specific and more structurally precise than a general caution against openness. He is pointing toward the specific condition under which genuine inner transformation occurs, and the specific way in which premature public performance of that transformation interferes with it. The distinction between these two things, genuine intimate sharing and premature public performance, is the distinction this entire video is organized around. Jung's understanding of the individuation process, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness that he considered the fundamental task of a human life, is built around a recognition that genuine interchange operates according to its own timing, its own rhythm, and its own requirements, and that these requirements are frequently in direct tension with the social impulses that most people bring to difficult experiences. The individuation process, as Jung describes it across his collected works, is not a linear progression with visible milestones and clear external signs of advancement. It is a gradual, often invisible, frequently nonlinear deepening of the person's relationship with their own totality, including the parts of themselves that have been suppressed, avoided, or simply never yet encountered. And it happens, Jung observed consistently, primarily in the interior, in the specific conditions of inwardness and self-confrontation that require, above all, protection from the dissipating pull of external attention and external evaluation. The alchemical symbolism that Jung spent decades studying offers some of his most precise images for understanding why this is so. The alchemical process, which Jung read not as a primitive attempt at chemistry, but as a projected, psychological process in which medieval practitioners were mapping the dynamics of their own unconscious, depends fundamentally on the integrity of the vase, the sealed vessel in which the transformation is occurring. The prima materia, the raw, unprocessed psychological material that needs to be transformed, must be enclosed, protected, held in a specific conditions of containment and internal heat. If the transformation is going to proceed to completion, when the vessel is opened prematurely, when the contents are exposed to outside air before the process is complete, the work is interrupted. The transformation reverts. The material that was beginning to change falls back toward its original, undifferentiated state. In alchemical terms, the opus, the great work, is ruined not by malice or error, but simply by premature exposure to the outside. Jung was entirely explicit about reading this alchemical image as a direct map of what happens to psychological transformation when it is shared before it is complete. Jung's engagement with alchemy went far deeper than the use of isolated images or metaphors. He spent decades studying alchemical texts in their original Latin, producing two major works, Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Coniunctionis, that trace the alchemical process as a complete symbolic map of the individuation journey. What he found consistently throughout this research was that the alchemists, whatever their conscious intentions regarding the transformation of base metals into gold, were describing, in projected symbolic form, the specific stages of a psychological transformation that followed the same structure as the individuation process he observed in his clinical patients. And one of the most consistent structural features of this alchemical, psychological map was the absolute requirement of the sealed vessel, the vas hermeticum, the hermetically sealed container in which the work could proceed without interference from the outside. The word hermetic itself, meaning airtight, sealed, protected from outside influence, comes from Hermes Trismegistus, the mythological figure associated with alchemical wisdom, and it has entered the language specifically because the protection of the sealed container was so central to the alchemical process that the concept needed a word of its own. When we describe something as hermetically sealed, We are, without knowing it, invoking a 3,000-year-old understanding of what genuine transformation requires. It requires the specific heat of sustained internal attention, the specific containment of privacy and silence, and the specific protection from the dissipating effect of collective engagement that premature sharing destroys. The moment you announce your transformation to the world's response to the announcement becomes part of what you are managing. And managing the world's response, even positive response, even genuinely warm and encouraging response, draws energy away from the actual work of transformation itself. Donald Winnicott, the British object relations psychoanalyst, whose work on early development offers important parallels to Jung's insights, approached this same territory from a different direction with his concept of the capacity to be alone. Winnicott observed that the capacity to be genuinely alone, to tolerate one's own company without the constant presence of an external other, is actually a sophisticated developmental achievement, one that develops in healthy early relationships and that is frequently disrupted in people who did not have the conditions for that development. The capacity to be alone, in Winnicott's framework, is not simply the ability to sit in an empty room. It is the ability to have a genuine relationship with one's own inner life, to experience feelings, thoughts, and processes as one's own rather than as performances for an audience, and to allow these internal processes to develop and complete themselves without the constant mediation of an external witness. The specific relevance to the question of premature disclosure is precise. A person who has not fully developed the capacity to be alone in Winnicott's sense, who has difficulty allowing internal processes to develop without an external witness, will find the impulse to share their recovery almost irresistible, not because sharing is inherently wrong, but because the internal process feels incomplete or unreal without external confirmation. Winnicott traced the developmental origins of this difficulty to early experiences in which a child's internal states were consistently responded to in ways that prioritized the caregiver's need to respond over the child's actual internal experience, so that the child learned at a pre-verbal level that the internal state itself was less real or less valuable than the social exchange it could generate. A child who learns this develops, as an adult, a tendency to experience their own inner life as somehow provisional, as not quite fully real, until it has been witnessed and confirmed by someone else. This is not a character flaw or a moral failing. It is a specific developmental outcome that has specific relational and therapeutic implications, and it is directly relevant to the pattern of premature sharing that we have been describing, because the urgency of the sharing impulse in these cases is, specifically, the urgency of needing external confirmation that something real is happening inside. The specific mechanism by which premature sharing interrupts genuine recovery is worth examining in concrete detail, because it operates in several distinct ways simultaneously. The first and most immediately obvious mechanism is what researchers in motivation psychology have called the substitution effect. When we share an intention, a goal, or a process of change with others, and receive social validation for that sharing, the validation itself produces a measurable psychological satisfaction that partially satisfies the need that was driving the change in the first place. The social recognition of the recovery serves in a very specific neurological sense as a partial substitute for the actual completion of the recovery, reducing the internal pressure that was motivating the genuine work of change. The person who announces their recovery journey to widespread positive response feels, genuinely and measurably, somewhat better, not because their recovery has advanced, but because the social exchange has provided a portion of what the recovery was meant to provide, a sense of being seen, valued, and belonging to a community. And this genuine, if partial, satisfaction reduces the urgency that was driving the internal work. making it easier to stay in the comfortable position of being publicly on a journey rather than completing the less comfortable, less socially recognized work of actually finishing one. The second mechanism is more subtle and more specifically Jungian. When you make your recovery public, you do not simply share information about an internal process. You create a persona around that process, a publicly legible version of your healing that can be communicated, understood, and responded to by others who are not inside your experience. This persona of the person who is healing, the brave one who is sharing their journey, the inspiring one who is being honest about their struggles, becomes, in Jung's framework, a new social role that carries its own expectations, its own demands, and its own incentives for maintaining the narrative it has established. And maintaining a public narrative is not the same activity as doing the internal work that the narrative is about. In fact, maintaining the public narrative can actively interfere with the internal work, because the internal work often requires revisions, setbacks, ambiguities, and complexities that the public narrative, once established, cannot easily accommodate without generating the specific social discomfort of appearing to have exaggerated an earlier success or misrepresented one's actual state. The third mechanism involves what Jung called the loss of numinosity. The numinous is Jung's term for the specific quality of experience that carries genuine psychological power, the felt sense of contact with something larger, deeper, or more significant than the ordinary ego, that accompanies genuine inner transformation. Jung observed that numinous experience has a specific relationship to privacy, specifically that it tends to dissipate when brought into the ordinary noise of collective social exchange. The moment a numinous experience becomes a social object, something to be shared, responded to, commented on, and evaluated by others, it loses the specific quality that made it powerful. It becomes information rather than experience. It becomes a story rather than a living process. And the person who told the story finds that they can no longer quite access the state that the story was describing, because the act of telling it has transformed it from an inner living reality into an outer social artifact. This dynamic has a specific implication for the common experience of feeling. After sharing a meaningful inner experience, that you can no longer quite return to it, that the experience has somehow become unavailable in the way it was available before the sharing. This is not imagination. It is a real psychological phenomenon with a specific mechanism, the conversion of experiential reality into representational reality. An experience is something you are inside of, something that is still in process, still affecting you, still able to develop and surprise you. A story is something you are outside of, something you have enclosed and fixed in language, and whose boundaries you now know. The moment you convert an experience into a story, even privately and even accurately, you change your relationship to it. And the moment you convert it into a public story, shaped by the requirements of communication and the anticipated responses of an audience, you change your relationship to it far more dramatically. The living experience that was still capable of transforming you becomes an artifact that you are now, in some sense, responsible for maintaining. Jung grounded this observation in his engagement with mystical and contemplative traditions across cultures, all of which have developed some version of the same insight. That genuine inner experience requires protection from premature disclosure. That speech about sacred or transformative experience tends to drain the experience of its power, and that the appropriate response to genuine inner change is a period of silence, integration, and private consolidation before any external expression is attempted. Rudolf Otto, whose concept of the numinous Jung borrowed and extended, described the numinous as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery that is simultaneously overwhelming and compelling, before which the ordinary ego feels its own smallness and the inadequacy of its ordinary categories of understanding. Otto observed that the appropriate response to numinous experience is awe, reverence, and a kind of hushed protective silence, precisely because the ordinary social language of everyday exchange is simply not adequate to contain what has been encountered, without diminishing it in the act of containment. This is why, across so many spiritual traditions, there are specific prohibitions on speaking about certain kinds of inner experience, not because the experience is shameful or secret in any negative sense, but because the very act of ordinary social speech about it converts it from a living experience into a report, from something being undergone into something being described. And in that conversion, something essential is lost. Jung observed the same dynamic in his clinical work, noting that patients who narrated their numinous experiences to too many people, or too quickly, found that the experiences themselves became inaccessible, their power drained by the act of converting them into social objects. The Buddhist tradition has developed elaborate frameworks for who should and should not be told about specific stages of meditative development. Indigenous initiation traditions typically involve periods of strict silence and withdrawal that must be maintained until the initiation is complete. The alchemists worked in secrecy, not simply to protect their trade secrets, but because they understood, at some level, that the work required containment. All of these traditions, across enormous cultural and historical distances, have arrived at the same structural understanding of a psychological truth that Jung articulated in the language of analytical psychology. Genuine transformation needs to be protected from premature exposure to collective attention. Mythology offers several images for this same insight. The story of Psyche and Eros is among the most precise. Psyche is told, explicitly and directly, that she must not look at her divine lover, must not bring the light of ordinary consciousness and ordinary social evaluation to bear on the relationship before it, is ready to survive that light. When she violates this prohibition, acting on the urgings of her sisters, who represent the voice of social comparison and collective opinion, the relationship is shattered and must be rebuilt through an enormously difficult series of tasks before it can be reconstituted on a more solid, more conscious, more durable foundation. The myth is read by Jungian interpreters as a precise map of the individuation process, and the prohibition on looking, on premature conscious examination, and especially premature social disclosure, maps directly onto what we have been describing. The relationship between Psyche and Eros, between the conscious ego and the deeper self it is in the process of integrating, cannot survive premature exposure to the light of ordinary consciousness and ordinary social judgment before the integration is complete. The story of the ugly duckling, which Bruno Bettelheim analyzed through a Jungian lens, and which Jung himself would have read as a transformation myth, contains a closely related structural element. The myth of Persephone offers an equally precise and perhaps even more powerful image for the specific kind of inner change that requires darkness and privacy to complete. Persephone descends into the underworld, into the darkest, most hidden, most completely private realm imaginable, and it is precisely there, in that absolute withdrawal from the surface world of social life and social visibility, that the transformation occurs that makes her the queen of two worlds rather than simply the innocent inhabitant of one. The underworld is not a place of punishment in this myth. It is a place of transformation. And the transformation requires the specific conditions of the underworld, the darkness, the distance from ordinary life, the complete absence of the social world's gaze and evaluation. When Persephone returns to the surface, she has been genuinely changed. But the change happened underground, out of sight, protected from exactly the exposure that the surface world would have provided if she had never descended. The story of Jonah in the belly of the whale carries the same structure and the same insight. The transformation that allows Jonah to complete his mission does not happen on the surface, in public, with an audience to witness and confirm it. It happens in the most extreme version of private darkness available, inside the whale, in the ocean's depths, alone with whatever the darkness contains. The 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, which appear as a motif across numerous religious and mythological traditions, represent the necessary period of private, protected inner work before any genuine outward movement becomes possible. The transformation from ugly duckling to swan does not happen in public. It happens through a period of solitary, painful, socially isolated struggle, during which the transforming creature is specifically denied the social belonging it craves, not as punishment, but because the transformation requires exactly the conditions that social belonging would prevent: sustained encounter with one's own nature, without the distorting mirror of others' opinions and others' categories. The swan that emerges from this process has been shaped entirely by the internal logic of its own development, not by the social environment's evaluation of what it was or what it should become. This is precisely the condition that premature public announcement of a recovery destroys. Modern social media culture has created what might be described as a structural incentive for exactly the behaviors that Jung, Winnicott, and the world's contemplative traditions all identify as undermining genuine transformation. The mechanisms of social media engagement, the immediate visible response to vulnerability, the quantifiable social validation of shares and comments and reactions, the specific narrative requirements of platforms that reward particular kinds of authentic sharing, all of these create strong, consistent, algorithmically amplified pressure toward the premature public performance of transformation at exactly the moments when genuine transformation is most in need of protected privacy. The vulnerability economy, as it has developed on social media platforms, is worth examining closely in this context. There is genuine value in the culture of honest sharing that social media has enabled. Genuine reduction of shame and isolation for people who discover, through public engagement with their struggles, that they are not alone. These are real goods, and dismissing them would be dishonest. But alongside these genuine goods, the vulnerability economy has created a specific set of perverse incentives that systematically reward the announcement of transformation over the completion of it, the performance of a journey over the arrival at a destination, the ongoing narration of a process over the private integration of its outcomes. A person sharing their recovery journey in real time is within the logic of these platforms, generating content. And content has very specific requirements that may or may not align with the requirements of genuine psychological recovery. There is a particular feature of social media engagement that deserves specific attention in this context, which is the function of the comment section as an engine of narrative closure. When you share a difficult experience and receive responses, the responses almost universally push toward resolution, toward the implication that you have understood something, learned something, grown in some specific and communicable way. Comments rarely say, "You are still in the middle of this, and that is exactly right, and there is nothing more to say yet." They say, "You are so brave for sharing this. You have come so far. Your insight is beautiful. You are inspiring." These responses are genuine expressions of genuine warmth, and the people offering them mean well. But they are also structurally committed to a narrative arc that requires a protagonist who is moving toward resolution. Because a protagonist who is simply still in the middle of something, with no insight, no progress, no learning yet available to communicate, provides nothing for the audience to respond to. A comment section cannot say nothing, and so it says something, and that something imports a narrative shape, a sense of meaning and progress and direction, onto a process that may not yet have any of those things. This imported narrative shape is not the same as the actual shape of the internal process. And organizing yourself around it means organizing yourself around a story about your recovery, rather than around the recovery itself. It needs to provide enough resolution to be satisfying while leaving enough uncertainty to generate continued engagement. These are the narrative requirements of a story, and they are not the same as the requirements of an actual inner process, which may need to be boring, irregular, ambiguous, and entirely resistant to satisfying narrative shape for extended periods before anything real has been accomplished. A concrete and recognizable case illustrates this clearly. Someone goes through a significant loss, the end of a relationship that defined years of their life. In the first weeks and months, the grief is real and private, lived in the body, occupying the interior in ways that have no language yet. Then the person begins sharing, first cautiously and then more regularly, processing the experience publicly, receiving the warmth and validation and me too, and you are so strong that social sharing of this kind reliably produces. Something happens in this process that is not entirely bad. Some of the isolation of grief is relieved, some sense of shared humanity is restored. But something else also happens. The grief begins gradually to take the shape of a story rather than an experience. The language for it develops faster than the integration of it. The publicly expressed version of the healing begins to run ahead of the actual healing, which is slower, messier, and far less narratively satisfying than what is being shared. And the person finds at some point that they are performing a version of recovery that is more complete than the actual recovery, partly because the audience has come to expect a certain trajectory, and partly because the performance of recovery has itself become a source of identity and social connection. That would be disrupted by an honest account of how much further there is still to go. Jung would read this as a precise clinical illustration of what he meant when he warned about premature disclosure. The recovery, which needed time and privacy to actually complete itself, was converted into a public narrative before it was ready. The public narrative provided a partial substitute for the actual completion, reducing the urgency of the internal work. The persona of the person who is healing bravely and sharing honestly became a new social identity that had its own requirements and its own investments, independent of the actual state of the underlying recovery. And the genuinely difficult, genuinely private, genuinely unshowable work that actual psychological integration requires was either never done or was done around the edges of the public performance, in whatever private space remained after the social exchange had taken its share. The research on goal sharing and motivation, while it was not designed with Jung in mind and makes no reference to individuation theory, confirms his clinical observation with remarkable precision. A series of experiments by Peter Gallwitzer and colleagues found consistently that sharing a goal or an intention with others who recognize and affirm the identity implications of that goal reduces the person's subsequent motivation to actually pursue the goal, because the social recognition has provided a premature sense of the identity-based reward that actually achieving the goal was supposed to deliver. People who shared their intentions were, in repeated experimental conditions, significantly less likely to persist in the behavior required to achieve them than people who kept their intentions private. The research is not about recovery specifically, but its mechanism is directly applicable. Premature social recognition of a transformation substitutes, in a specific and measurable way, for the actual completion of the transformation. It announces that the question of what to actually do with this understanding is important, and it deserves a concrete, practical answer rather than simply a structural critique of premature sharing. The first practice is what might be called the completion threshold, a personal commitment to giving any genuine inner process a protected period of private development before any external expression is attempted. The specific length of this threshold will vary enormously depending on the nature of the process and the person's own psychological structure. But the principle is consistent. Before you share, where you are in a recovery or a transformation. Ask honestly whether the process has reached a point of genuine internal stability, a point at which the sharing would be an expression of something that has already happened rather than an announcement of something that is still in progress. The distinction matters enormously. Sharing from a place of genuine completion or genuine stable progress is entirely different from sharing from a place of need for the social validation that the sharing will generate. The first is communication. The second is a form of substitution. The second practice is the cultivation of what we might call a sacred inner circle, a very small number of people, ideally one or two, with whom genuine inner work can be shared without the substitution dynamic occurring. The substitution effect and the premature persona formation are specifically products of public or semi-public sharing, of the kind of sharing that reaches an audience. Genuine intimate sharing with someone who knows you well enough that they will not receive your process as a performance and not respond to it as an audience is a different activity entirely and does not carry the same risks. Jung's own therapeutic practice was premised on exactly this distinction: the therapeutic relationship as a protected, private, boundaried space in which inner material could be made conscious without being made public, examined without being performed, and integrated without being narrated for an audience. The third practice draws directly from Jung's alchemical framework, protecting the seal of the vessel. This means becoming conscious of the specific moments in any recovery or transformation process when the urge to share is strongest, and asking honestly what that urge is about. Is it about communication, genuinely wanting to connect with another person around an experience? Or is it about need, specifically the need for validation, reassurance, or the sense that the process is real because someone else has witnessed it? The urge to share is not always the same urge, and distinguishing between these motivations in real time requires a degree of honest self-examination that most social media environments actively discourage. But it is exactly this discrimination that determines whether sharing will support or undermine the underlying process. The fourth practice is the deliberate cultivation of private rituals for marking the milestones of inner change. Practices that acknowledge and honor real progress without converting it into a social object. Journaling is the most obvious of these, the private written record that allows you to name, witness, and anchor genuine inner changes without distributing them to an audience. Ritual objects, meaningful marks of progress in physical forms that are entirely private, serve a similar function. Even the simple practice of pausing to fully inhabit a moment of genuine inner progress, of allowing it to become real to yourself before moving on, constitutes a form of private acknowledgement that can substitute effectively for the social acknowledgement most people instinctively reach for. Fifth practice is what Jung himself called the night sea journey, the willingness to remain in the darkness of a process that has not yet resolved, without forcing resolution by announcing a completion that has not yet occurred. A sixth and final practice involves what might be called selective retrospective sharing, a deliberate choice to share inner processes after they have completed, rather than while they are ongoing. This practice honors both the genuine human need for connection around difficult experience and the genuine requirement of the transformation process for protected privacy during its most vulnerable stages. It produces a specific quality of sharing that is qualitatively different from real-time narration, a sharing that comes from a place of genuine integration. That can include the full complexity of what the process involved, including its most unshowable and most ambiguous moments. And that does not require the process to conform to narrative requirements it never actually met. The person who shares what they went through after having genuinely gone through it is not performing a journey. They are reporting from the other side of one. And this is not only more honest, it is also, in almost every case, more genuinely useful to the people who receive it. because it carries the weight of something that has actually been completed, rather than the lighter, more fragile weight of something that is still in progress, and that may yet be interrupted by the very sharing that announces it. But remaining honestly in the middle, protecting the process from the premature narrative closure that public sharing imposes, is precisely what allows the process to actually complete itself, rather than being frozen at whatever stage it had reached when the performance of completion began. There is a specific and important distinction worth drawing here between privacy about inner process and secrecy about genuine difficulty. Jung was not recommending that people conceal struggles that put themselves or others at risk, or that they suffer in isolation when genuine human support would serve their recovery. He was making a much more precise observation about the specific conditions that genuine psychological transformation requires, an observation that applies most directly to the process of integration, the private work of bringing previously split off or unexamined material into a more conscious, more functional relationship with the rest of the psyche. This work can and should happen in genuine therapeutic relationships. It can and should happen in genuinely intimate personal relationships, built on real mutual knowledge and real mutual trust. What it cannot happen in, or what happens only with great difficulty, and only in its most superficial layers, is the public social environment that most people currently use as their primary arena for processing difficult experience, the hermit figures that appear in mythology and in the world's spiritual traditions offer a final, and I think the most important image for understanding what Jung is pointing toward. The hermit, whether it is the desert fathers of early Christianity, the forest-dwelling sages of the Hindu tradition, the wandering monks of Zen, or the isolated shamans of indigenous traditions across the world, is a figure who withdraws specifically from the social environment in order to do work that the social environment makes impossible. This work is not valued by the social environment, precisely because the social environment has no framework for evaluating work that produces no visible product, that takes no shareable form, and that cannot be narrated in the language of progress toward externally legible goals. The hermit's work is invisible, private, and slow, and it is, in every tradition that honors these figures, the most important work available. You do not need to become a hermit to apply this principle. You need only to understand that genuine inner work has a hermit quality, a quality of withdrawal, of turning away from the collective's attention and evaluation, of protecting the delicate process of inner change from the very real dissipating effect of collective engagement. And this understanding, applied with practical wisdom and without rigidity, is one of the most powerful tools available for ensuring that the recovery, the transformation, the genuine inner change you are working toward, actually completes itself rather than being perpetually announced and never quite arrived at. The next time you feel the impulse to share where you are in a process that is genuinely unfinished, pause for a moment before opening the app, not to suppress the impulse, but to examine it honestly. Is this communication, or is this need? Is this expression of something that has genuinely happened, or is this a reach for the social warmth that the expression will generate? Is this sharing in service of the process, or is this sharing as a substitute for it? The answer will not always be the same, and the capacity to ask the question honestly every time, and to act on the answer rather than the impulse, is one of the most important, least discussed, and most practically consequential psychological skills that Jung's understanding of the individuation process makes available. Protect the vessel. Let the work complete itself. The world will see what you have become soon enough. What you are becoming is yours for now, and it needs to stay that way. There is a specific quality that people who have done this, who have protected a genuine inner process long enough for it to actually complete, tend to notice in retrospect. When they eventually share what they went through, The sharing has a particular weight and a particular clarity that the real-time narration of an ongoing process never quite manages to produce. They know what they are talking about. They are speaking from inside a completed experience rather than announcing an intention or a progress. The people who hear them often notice this too, a quality of genuine knowing rather than genuine trying, of having actually arrived somewhere rather than being publicly committed to a direction. This quality cannot be performed. It can only be earned by the specific, invisible, private work that no platform rewards and that no audience validates while it is happening. And it is, when it appears, unmistakable. It is the specific authority of someone who went all the way through something, alone, in the dark, without an audience, and came out the other side with something that is genuinely and irreversibly theirs.